Welcome to the debate. Today we're looking at a technology that, well, it's moving from science fiction to a potential scientific reality: functional immortality. We're talking about reliably preventing death from aging and disease, extending a healthy life for centuries, and the implications. They're just staggering. They really force us to confront this foundational tension.
Right.
On one hand, you have this profound moral potential, the end of age-related suffering, a massive expansion of what humans can achieve. But on the other, you have these stark risks of catastrophic social disruption, political imbalance, and, a deepening of inequality like we've never seen.
Exactly.
So the question we're wrestling with today is this: does eliminating suffering and expanding human flourishing justify pursuing this technology now? Or do the risks, especially around unequal access, make it just reckless?
My position is that prolonging a flourishing life is a core moral good. We have a duty to pursue it. I see this as potentially the greatest medical achievement in history, if, and it's a big if, we govern it correctly.
And I come at this from a fundamentally different starting point. While reducing suffering is a noble goal, I believe this technology risks amplifying every single injustice we already have. It could completely undermine social stability unless we establish these unprecedented political and economic structures first. The issue for me isn't just can we do it, but should we rush to deploy it before we've answered these profound questions of justice? Because if the pursuit of infinite life for some destabilizes finite life for everyone, then we've failed.
I do appreciate the commitment to prudence, I really do. But let me offer a different perspective on the fundamental human drive here. If true biological immortality, the actual stopping of senescence, were safe and possible, it would represent the largest reduction of suffering at scale we can even conceive of. Aging is the primary risk factor for almost everything that gets us in the end: Alzheimer's, cancer, heart disease. Stopping that process, it eliminates this massive, preventable source of pain and death. But the promise goes so far beyond just survival. Think about the maximization of autonomy, of opportunity. Imagine the sheer accumulation of expertise, the continuity of culture, the ability for people to achieve mastery across centuries, to build these deep, multi-century projects. When knowledge and experience are retained instead of being lost every 80 years, the rate of human progress, it could just accelerate beyond anything we can comprehend. My view is that the ethical duty is to minimize preventable death, and concerns about distribution, they're not a reason to stop science. They're a mandate to develop robust policy, public funding, global cooperation to ensure access.
That is a compelling vision of potential, it is. But I'm hesitant to follow a line of reasoning that, to me, seems to minimize the structural threat here. You mentioned functional immortality, and we have to pause and be really clear what we're debating, because the policy implications are completely different depending on the modality. Are we talking about true biological extension, slowing or stopping aging in the original body, maintaining one's consciousness? Or are we talking about replication of consciousness, digital transfers, creating copies?
No, that's a crucial point. We must be clear. We're focused on biological extension, the continuous healthy lifespan of the existing self. Replication, digital consciousness, that raises entirely different, deep philosophical questions about personal identity that are separate from what we're discussing today.
Good. Okay. So, assuming biological extension, the threat remains existential. History shows us that access to breakthrough medical tech is almost always unequal, at least at first. If immortality is restricted to the wealthy, even for just a few decades, it risks entrenching privilege across generations in a way that is basically irreversible. You're talking about the creation of immortal dynasties that can lock up political power, resources, and influence indefinitely.
I see why you frame the challenge in terms of wealth concentration. That is the pivot point for many skeptics. But we have to look at the whole economic balance sheet. Pursuing functional immortality isn't just a cost. It has monumental, positive fiscal implications.
Go on.
Right now, we are burdened by these astronomical healthcare costs for geriatric care. Treating the very chronic, age-related illnesses you mentioned. dementia, heart failure, late-stage cancers. If you eliminate senescence, you eliminate the vast majority of those costs. You free up massive resources that are currently dedicated to just managing decline. And those resources could be redirected toward R&D, infrastructure, addressing poverty. We're talking about reshaping global GDP.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that the potential healthcare savings offset the structural threat of compounding wealth. Let me tell you why. When you give an indefinite life to the people who are currently wealthy, their assets compound geometrically. They're not burdened by generational splits, by death taxes. We aren't talking about small increases in inequality. We're talking about creating a permanent, globally entrenched plutocratic oligarchy. If a wealthy family starts with $10 billion and compounds that for 500 years, that accumulation becomes unassailable. So the core economic threat here isn't healthcare efficiency. It's the fundamental structure of power and capital. To counter that, you would need revolutionary policies, universal progressive wealth taxes, strict global inheritance limits, maybe even radical land reform applied worldwide and maintained forever.
I agree on the necessity of redesigning financial systems. Absolutely. We'd need flexible career phase savings, labor market reforms, and yes, stronger mechanisms to prevent wealth consolidation. But the fact that we need to redesign these systems isn't a justification for accepting preventable death. The failure to pursue longevity is a failure to reduce universal preventable suffering. We have to commit to addressing distribution through policy while we advance the science.
But this is where the whole debate hinges. You're asking for a global consensus on radical fiscal policies, policies that require the powerful to give up power, either before or at the same time as you deploy a technology that guarantees power permanence to the first adopters. The geopolitical reality is that these reforms will be intensely resisted by the very people who benefit from the technology. We're asking for a global coordinated agreement on massive wealth redistribution from the most powerful people on Earth who have just gained indefinite life. That's not a policy challenge, it's a utopian fantasy. And without that consensus, power asymmetries will dominate immediately.
Okay, let's shift to the other major challenge you raise: political entrenchment, governance. I will concede that the risk of long-lived leaders monopolizing power or entrenching authoritarian regimes it's severe. Democratic renewal often depends on turnover. However, these risks are manageable, I believe, if we prioritize institutional reforms preemptively.
Manageable in theory, maybe, but profoundly difficult in practice. The problem is simple. Institutional integrity is often maintained by mortality. It's a feature, not a bug. If leaders and policymakers become functionally immortal, they have centuries to consolidate influence, subvert democratic mechanisms, and block mobility for every single generation that follows. The very definition of a meritocracy, of a thriving democracy, requires the young to replace the old. Immortality could destroy that engine of change. And we can't ignore the ethical black hole this opens up in our justice system.
How so?
Well, if indefinite sentences are handed down, perpetual punishment becomes this terrifying, inhumane reality. It would demand a complete philosophical overhaul of rehabilitation, of justice. Imagine being in prison, or just socially excluded, for a crime you committed 300 years ago.
That is a very compelling point about the sheer ethical pressure that puts on our justice systems. We would absolutely be forced to pivot away from retributive justice and focus almost exclusively on rehabilitation and social reconciliation. You'd probably need mandated, time-based reentry mechanisms, even for severe offenses. But regarding political stasis, we have tools to counteract that. We just have to mandate them globally and make them legally unassailable. I'm talking about enforceable strict term limits for any political office, mandatory retirement ages from public service, not from working, maybe, but from positions of state power, and rigorous global anti-nepotism laws. The risk isn't in the biology, it's in our failure to apply the right political safeguards.
But again, you're relying on the implementation of policy by groups who, upon achieving immortality, will have zero incentive to restrict their own power. What is the practical likelihood of getting a mandatory retirement rule passed by a group of leaders who've had centuries to manipulate the levers of state? The motivation for them to limit their own power vanishes the moment indefinite life is on the table. You're asking for a global, self-sacrificing regulatory framework to be built and maintained by the exact people who benefit most from its failure. Which brings us to the foundational moral stance. I maintain that sometimes you have to delay deployment until comprehensive, globally enforceable safeguards exist. That is the only ethically responsible path. We have to exercise prudence over blind progress. The stakes are just too high to risk permanently stratifying humanity.
I view functional immortality as a powerful tool like the discovery of fire or the development of antibiotics. These things carry enormous potential for good if governed correctly, but they also pose great risks. The core humanitarian goal, as I see it, is twofold. We have to simultaneously pursue the reduction of death and build the necessary institutions to manage it. To stop pursuing the technologies to accept needless suffering on a universal scale for all future generations. Our efforts have to be geared toward universal access and strong, preemptive regulation from day one.
And that is precisely where we fundamentally diverge. Pursuing this technology without first demonstrating that we have resilient, enforceable global institutions already in place is reckless. It's potentially catastrophic. The history of technology shows that the benefits arrive first and fastest for the powerful, and the costs, social, economic, are borne by the vulnerable. Given the magnitude of the risks here, from population dynamics to dynastic power, we must prioritize global equity and governance reforms before widespread adoption. It's not enough to hope policy will catch up. Policy has to decisively lead the way.
This discussion has really highlighted the immense challenge that comes with such radical potential. I would still maintain that maximizing human flourishing and eliminating suffering has to be the primary driver of this effort, with robust, preemptive policy acting as the governor to ensure access is distributed fairly.
And I still insist that the sheer size of the risks, the amplification of injustice, the threat of authoritarian entrenchment demands that we prioritize structural stability and global equity first. The goal has to be a just and meaningful extended life for everyone, not just an immortal life for a select few.
We both agree, I think, on one fundamental point. The question of whether immortality should be adopted widely is not just a scientific challenge. It is fundamentally a political, an economic, an ethical, and a cultural one that touches every part of society.
Absolutely. The technology's long-term value depends far less on its technical existence than on how we as a global society choose to integrate it, regulate it, and share it. The preparation required has to match the promise being offered.